So guys, it's Brad from the Ed Army, and we're back again as it's time to dive into Engine Access as we go over the Magnifistorm or the MST archetype and show you what you can do with this deck, as we're going to be showing some of the abilities it can do as we go over the cards and showcase some of the cards or decks you maybe not looked at that can actually synergize with the strategy and give you a step in getting better towards winning and showcasing the power of Mystical Space Typhoon. But before I get into it, as always, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. It does help out. We are on the storm to 1,000 subs, and I can only get there with your help, so please get and join on as we're going forward, and I'd love your help. But we're jumping straight into it as we start with our first monster, as I'll go through the monsters, then the spells and traps. So getting into it, we have first Magnifistorming Suin. So if you have Mystical Space Typhoon in your graveyard or your opponent controls no spells/traps, you could special summon this card from your hand. You can only special summon Magnifistorming Suin once per turn this way. If this card is normal or special summoned, you can add one Magnifistorm spell/trap or one Mystical Space Typhoon from your deck to your hand. You can only use this effect of Magnifistorming Suin once per turn. We move to the next one, being Magnifistorming Megala. This one, if you have a Mystical Space Typhoon in your graveyard or your opponent controls no spell/traps, you can special summon this card from your hand. You can only special summon Magnifistorming Megala once per turn. This way, if a Magnifistorm quick play spell or a Mystical Space Typhoon is activated, you can special summon one Magnifistorm monster from your deck with a different name from the monsters you control. Also, you cannot special summon for the rest of this turn except wind monsters. You can only use this effect of Magnifistorming Megala once per turn. Moving into the other and final main deck monster, that's level 3 at the time, being Magnifistorming Erdam. If you control or if you have Mystical Space Typhoon in your graveyard or your opponent controls no spell/traps, you can special summon this card from your hand. You can only special summon Magnifistorming Erdam once per turn this way. If this card is normal or special summoned, you can add one Magnifistorm monster or one Mystical Space Typhoon from your deck to your hand, except Magnifistorming Erdam. You can only use this effect of Magnifistorming Erdam once per turn. Now we'll move into the first of the only level 6 monster, that being Magnifistorming Crothia. Cannot be destroyed by battle or card effects while your opponent controls no spell/traps. You can only use each effect of the following effects of Magnifistorming Crothia once per turn. If a quick play spell card is activated except during the damage step, you can special summon this card from your hand. If this card is normal or special summoned, you can add one Magnifistorm card and or one Mystical Space Typhoon from your deck and or graveyard to your hand, except Magnifistorming Crothia. This one's always going to give me trouble. Also, you cannot special summon monsters for the rest of this turn except wind monsters. Pretty cool. Going into the first of the main deck monsters that are above the level 6 slot, being level 8s and 10s. First, we have Magnifistorm Great Pyrophonics. This one, if a quick play spell card is activated except during the damage step, you can special summon this card from your hand. If a quick play spell is activated except during the damage step, you can target up to 2 cards your opponent controls as cost, shuffle them into the deck at resolution. If Mystical Space Typhoon is activated while this card is in your graveyard, you can special summon this card. You can only use each effect of Magnifistorm Great Pyrophonics once per turn, so pretty cool. Going into the next one, we have Magnifistorm Vortex Beauty Valrune. These names are really long. If a quick play spell card is activated except during the damage step, you can special summon this card from your hand. When your opponent activates a monster effect and you have Mystical Space Typhoon in your graveyard, as a quick effect, you can negate that effect. Then if you have 2 or more Mystical Space Typhoon in your graveyard, you can destroy that monster. If Mystical Space Typhoon is activated while this card is in your graveyard, you can special summon this card. You can only use each effect of Magnifistorm Vortex Beauty Valrune once per turn. Whew, what a mouthful for that monster. Now let's jump into the spells. First being the one I think is probably going to see the most play, being Magnifistorming Sight Trance. Now you can only activate one of these effects, but you can only use each effect of Magnifistorming Sight Trance once per turn. First effect, you get to draw 2 cards, then you discard one Magnifistorm card or one quick play spell, or if you don't have any in your hand, you discard your entire hand. Pretty wild. And then for its second effect, you can add one Mystical Space Typhoon from your deck or graveyard to your hand. If this card is destroyed by the effect of Mystical Space Typhoon, you can set this card. Pretty cool. Going into our next spell, we have Magnifistorm, Magnifistorming Stanza Tribute. This one allows you to activate one of these effects, but you can only use each effect of Magnifistorming Stanza Tribute once per turn. For its first effect, you get to add one level 4 or lower Magnifistorm monster from your deck to your hand, and its second effect allows you to add Mystical Space Typhoon from your deck or graveyard to your hand. If this card is destroyed by the effect of Mystical Space Typhoon, you can set this card. Additionally, we have Magnifistorming Summoning Technique. This one, very similar to the others, well, that has the same condition of activating one of these effects, but you can only use each effect of Magnifistorming Summoning Technique once per turn. For its first effect, you send one Magnifistorm monster from your deck to the graveyard, and for the second effect, add one Mystical Space Typhoon from the deck or graveyard to your hand. If this card is destroyed by the effect of Mystical Space Typhoon, you can set this card. Pretty cool. Going into the final card, which is the trap, we have Magnifistorming Sovereign Tyranny. This is a continuous trap. Once per turn, you can target 3 quick play spells in your graveyard, including a Magnifistorm card as cost, and then you apply these effects in sequence. First, you would shuffle them into the deck, and then draw one card, and then when monsters you control will gain 300 attack and defense for the rest of this turn. Then once per chain, when Mystical Space Typhoon is activated, you can target one face-up card your opponent controls as cost, negate its effects. If this card is destroyed by the effect of Mystical Space Typhoon, you can set this card. Well, that was a mouthful, and we have covered the entire Magnifistorm archetype, so let's talk a little bit about what it does, and a little bit about what you can do with it with the decks in a second. So going really into it quick, let's talk about the monsters. So the interesting thing about the monsters that I find is that this is actually a fully sort of supported deck. I'm not going to say this is a perfect deck at all, but definitely it has all the right tools to get started. You have multiple ways to have extenders also work as starters, so you can normal summon some of these cards to get searches, but additionally you can have them special summon themselves as long as you have Mystical Space Typhoon in your grave or your opponent controls no spell/traps. So it's really cool to do that. And additionally, this means going first, this deck does have a little bit more of a better shot at playing, because even if your opponent has hand traps, one of the advantages you have is you can summon these cards, because there's a very good chance your opponent will not control any spells and traps on turn 0, which I'm kind of grateful that's not a thing yet. But it's important in this archetype because this means that the deck really does pop off well going first, but it does have the ability to do pretty well going second too if your opponent doesn't control any spells and traps, which isn't a necessity in a lot of decks, but it is somewhat more of a condition that can be met because not every deck relies on spells and traps. But importantly, Suin being the ability to search for the Magnifistorm spells or traps is very important, because this one allows you to enable your searches for Mystical Space Typhoon, but more importantly, the Magnifistorm spells and traps are very good, so you really want to get access to them. Additionally, Megala being the ability to make the pure deck, I think, a lot better, and the reason why I say that is that being able to basically spawn out any of the Magnifistorm monsters from the deck with a different name from anything you control by just simply activating a Magnifistorm quick play spell or Mystical Space Typhoon, I think is insane, because this is an effect that if it goes unresolved, if you're playing this deck in a pure version with stun cards, I think this becomes really powerful, because now you can bring out cards like the Great Pyre Phoenix and also Malrune, because you're able to just bring these big bodies to the field, which is really crazy just by activating one of the archetype cards or Mystical Space Typhoon, which is a part of the archetype obviously, but it's just really good that Megala can do that. And additionally, Erdam is really cool because I like the ability to just search for the monsters, because although at first some people might say, well, is this effect good? It's just like pretty okay. The point is, Erdam is your way of getting your additional monsters in rotation. So like maybe you want to grab your one-ofs off of this, like Pyre Phoenix and Valrune, or in the case, or even something like Coritha. But the point is, Erdam allows you to also grab your follow-up for your different cards if you want to get Megala again, or if you want to grab access to Suin, because it is probably the best starter, because Suin does get you all of the spells and traps, vice versa get you to the archetype. So point is, getting access to another monster right away is fantastic, and I think that's exactly why. Looking at the level 5 and higher monsters, Crothia is a okay card. I think its only weakness is that you have to get this thing onto the field. It does not have a very good well, I mean, it doesn't have a bad way to get itself on the field. It's just that this card definitely would just sit in your hand. So I don't really think you want to do that. And, just being honest about it, it's just always better that you have a card that doesn't drag you down. But the card does have a good effect, being able to double search you for a Magnifistorm card and or Mystical Space Typhoon, but this also includes the Mystical Space Typhoon, if I'm correct, from the deck or graveyard. So this means you can recycle the Mystical Space Typhoon, which, you know, kind of summoning one card and getting two cards, not gonna lie, that's pretty good. So you want to keep that in mind. But additionally, going into the big bosses, which is where this is important, Great Pyre Phoenix, I think it's really cool that the monsters that are the big bosses, right, they're able to spawn themselves out of the hand, which is really good because this means that they're not bricks as long as you have a quick play to use. That's the Magnifistorm cards. But more importantly, for Great Pyre Phoenix, it just says if a quick play spell is activated, which means Phonics will immediately jump out of your hand because you're going to just use quick plays in general. So this is just very solid. Additionally, if a quick play spell is activated, for that effect to target two cards and then shuffle them into the deck, I think this isn't that bad. I think a lot of people might be sleeping on this card because if you really read, if Phonics sticks on the field and actually gets the double shuffle back in, that's really dangerous. I think that can really disrupt a lot of boards, and it makes Phonics a really cool card. Additionally, if Mystical Space Typhoon is activated while Phonics is in the grave, summoning itself back is absolutely insane. I think it's a phenomenal card, and I think that alone allows it to really prove as a good boss because it doesn't just summon itself from the hand, it can also summon itself from the grave. Also, it's a wind monster, so like we don't have to worry about bestials, which is kind of hilarious but awesome. But I think it's really cool. The effect, like I said, is insane because being able to activate a quick play spell and then immediately being able to use the effect of the Phonics to target two cards and shuffle them back, I think that's just crazy. I think that's really good, and I think it's really good removal because it dodges a lot of cards. Yes, it does have to target, but like I said, that's really strong to spawn off two cards. Now going into Valrune as the last one, I think this card having the very similar effects to Phonics is fine. It makes sense. I think it's really smart. I do like the fact that it is a negate for the archetype because being able to stop a monster effect while you have Mystical Space Typhoon in the grave is really cool. I do think that's one of the problems though, is if you're going to run this as an engine, you can't really run Valrune as well because maybe you're not running MST, which believe it or not, you don't actually have to run it. But if you're playing pure, I think this is fine. You definitely want to run one of these because it does summon itself back it does summon itself and does summon itself from the hand and grave just like Phonics. So I think Valrune is fine, but being able to only be able to destroy the monster if you have two or more Mystical Space Typhoons, I'm not gonna lie, it does kind of suck because I don't really think you'd want to run two MSTs. It's not that good. Like, MST is actually pretty decent, especially if it's being searchable because it's just a good pop, and you can pop your own cards in archetype, which is great. But the point is, this isn't a very good effect to have if you have to have two, because no one really wants to run two MSTs. Like, there's not many spells and trap decks in the format you'd want to actually side like 2 or 3 of MSTs in the deck. So even in the pure version, I don't know if that's actually going to work. But Valrune's still a pretty good card, as in pure, you'd probably run one, but in engines, you're not going to do. Going into the spells and traps, Sight Trance obviously is the best one, and when I go into the decks that will be able to use this card, I think this is the one that will see the most play outside of the actual like deck, because Sight Trance just generically says you have to discard a quick play spell. There is a ton of decks that might want to run this as an engine, because effectively, if you draw 2 cards and then you discard, and if you don't have anything to discard, or if you don't have any in your hand in terms of like you don't draw access to a Magnifistorm or quick play spells, in discarding the entire hand actually could be beneficial to certain decks. I think this might enable some really weird deck building that people might go with. So I think that card's really cool, and I do like that effect because if you're playing Magnifistorm as an engine, I think you can't go wrong by drawing 2 and then pitching like the big bodies, because obviously for the core deck, you're going to be wanting to discard your Phonics and your Valrune because they can summon themselves from the grave. So I think that's a really cool concept. Also, this card is searchable in the deck, so if you're running an engine, it does benefit a player for running more Magnifistorm cards, because getting access to this is like really strong, and it does allow you the ability to push your decks to higher limits depending if it's like a quick play deck. Especially the fact that Suin searches Sight Trance is just like really good. So it's very underestimated how good this card is. And then if it gets destroyed by the effect of Mystical Space Typhoon, you said it, in pure, this is basically like, even if your opponent doesn't have spells and traps, you pop your own spells and traps. And if I just want to make sure if this is correct, if you use this card's effect, Chain MST, to pop it, I'm pretty sure this still sets it. So I think that's actually really crazy, because if I'm right, it just says if this card is destroyed by the effect of Mystical Space Typhoon, not if this set card is destroyed by Mystical Space Typhoon. I think that's insane, because this means that Sight Trance, effectively, you activate this, you're going to resolve that effect, but then you go, okay, Chain MST destroy Sight Trance, so then you'd resolve the effect, you draw 2, discard 1, whatever. You're like, okay, that's whatever. They're like, oh, you put MST in the grave, doesn't matter. They're like, effect of Sight Trance since it was destroyed, I'll set it back. And you're like, ooh, that's really good. And then Sight Trance just allows you to do that. So I think it's cool. Stanza Tribute. I think this card's actually pretty interesting because in engine decks, they will definitely run this card. This is because this is like an in-theme. It's not an E-Telly, but it is a quick play search. So like your Wanteds, for instance, like Diabell Star, I think it's a really cool concept. And yeah, being able to add a level 4 lower monsters is good because that's basically the core engine. You want to be able to have this search for them so you can get your engine going if you want. Additionally, adding MST I didn't mention is really good, and then all the quick plays actually search for Mystical Space Typhoon as well, and or bring it back to your hand from the grave. I think it's really cool because I guess in some instances the MST might actually matter. So you know, hey, go for it. But I think it's cool having the same effect to be if it's destroyed, you set it back. If it's destroyed by MST, very solid, very good card. Additionally, summoning technique. I think this card's really cool because it's not as good in the engine unless you want to run like Phonics and Valrune. But in the pure deck, I think this card's insane because this allows you to set up your grave. So what you would do is you really want to load in the Valrune or the Phonics immediately, so that immediately when you go for the other quick plays, you're then able to spawn them back. And it still has the same effect to set it back because this card isn't horrible, I think. You know, you can set it back. It's probably the least of the important ones just because the different effects of the Magnifistorms don't really benefit anything when they're in the grave. That's like the only problem, is if they had beneficial graveyard effects outside of Phonics and Valrune, then this would be a great card. But because a lot of them don't really do anything, this doesn't really matter that much. So that's just my opinion, but it's kind of the point. This card's not bad at all because it's literally a Foolish Burial for the entire monsters in the archetype, but you're not really going to be doing much with that. And then you can also add MST, so you know, hey, go for it. Finally, going into Sovereign Tyranny, I really think this card's actually pretty crazy because in the engine deck I'll talk about in a second, I think this is actually a very good card because it generically targets just quick plays. It doesn't say different names either, so you can load any. You just have to make sure you have one Magnifistorm card as your target. So if you're running a large engine in the Magnifistorm cards, or you're running an engine in the Magnifistorm deck that happens to have a lot of quick plays, this is a fantastic synergy here in my opinion because you can target any of those quick plays to put them back. And then you get to draw one immediately, which is cool. Giving all the wind monsters 300 attack and defense for the rest of the turn is okay. I don't think it's terrible. I think they could have at least said for each card you shuffle back, that would have been cool because then it makes them really big, but I digress. But then the once per chain effect, when Mystical Space Typhoon is activated, targeting a face-up card your opponent controls and you negate its effects, I think is really cool. I think that just gives this specific pure version of the deck the ability to really I would say like not even just magnify or maximize its ability. It really just pump it up and allows it to use more pressure in that regard. And then if it's destroyed by the effect of Mystical Space Typhoon, you set it as well. So a very good card nonetheless. But going into the decks we can splash it in, we're going to the first one being Runic. I think Runic Magnifistorm is actually a very smart concept. I think this is a very good like anti-meta deck because what the actual Magnifistorm deck is missing is it just doesn't have a lot of ways to pressure the opponent. It's a very interesting, like I would say mid-range control deck where it focuses more on using MST to like pop your own cards so that you get beneficial effects, but also MST is rotated into the archetype being a disruption, but the monsters really don't do as much. It's not till you get into something like your bosses where they put the pressure on the field. So in that case, Magnifistorm really needs an engine that can support it by offering more disruption or offer the aggression that it lacks. That's where Runic comes in. Runic also benefits from Magnifistorm, especially because the archetype allows them to use some of the other cards in the archetype as ways to fuel the engine, but also fuel themselves. So like for instance, Sight Trance in this archetype is insane because you can just throw Sight Trance into the Runic deck and actually always benefit for the most part because you'll always be discarding your quick plays. But in the Magnifistorm deck, it's very important because you're using the Runic cards as additional supply. So the reason I say supply is like with the Runic deck, you're always going to try to get Fountain in rotation so that you can draw cards. Now this is beneficial for Runic already because Fountain is just broken, but the point is for Magnifistorm this is really good because the Runic cards are offering the archetype the little bit of disruption that it needs so that it can keep pace with the opponents. Like this is very interesting because a turn 1 play for Magnifistorm and Runic cards only really gets shut down if the opponent has Droll and Lockbird. If the opponent does not have Droll and Lockbird, then this is pretty much going to be tough for them because even if they hand trap the deck, a lot of the effects don't really do much. Like, you're not really summoning as much as you think. Like a Fualos and a Perulia may get a draw or two at most, but they're not really going to get a lot of draws. You're not focusing on the concept of like summoning a bunch in this version. You're really just trying to establish the ability of getting the runic cards that can be activated during your turn off, and then when your opponent gets to their turn, you have multiple layers of disruption coming from the different Magnifistorm cards. If you get the bosses online, or if you just got access to drawing a lot, the runic cards will put the pressure on your opponent while you constantly draw back with the different Magnifistorm cards. Like, for instance, Tyranny is actually decent in this deck because I said it's an additional like fountain. This allows you to kind of put back 3 of the quick plays. If, say, for instance, they ash the fountain, you can immediately use the Tyranny to at least put 3 of them back and draw 1. So you're still cycling a bit more, but also the fact that by using MST in the archetype, you can even pop your own quick plays off so that MST goes into the graveyard, so it can use its own effect actually being utilized with the other cards that have the effect of, if MST pops this, they set them. It's more or less making sure that MST puts itself in grave, so it's always a constant target to be reshuffled back, and also it can pop the runic cards to gain more advantage by just simply being used in the same chain, popping them, no really reason except like maybe triggering Tyranny or triggering some of the other effects of the other cards. And I think that's just really cool. So it gives the runic version probably the best chance at being the engine deck that will use the Magnifistorm cards first. So I do think it's cool, and I think that's like one of the reasons to think about it. Now, talking about one that I actually just recently saw, and I actually think this deck actually makes a little bit more sense, is going to be Magnifistorm. So Tri-Brigade Magnifistorm is interesting because the Magnifistorm monsters are all different types. So there is a Beast Warrior and there is a Wing Beast in the form of, I think, Suin and in the form of... These names always get me, so I'm not sure. In the form of Erdam. Sorry, Erdam and Suin are actually Beast Warrior, or Beast Warrior, Wing Beast. Now, the reason this is important is that at first this engine to me didn't make sense until I remembered the fact that we're getting Tri-Brigade support in Doom's Dimension that offers a new quick play to the deck that's actually really good in Tri-Brigade Hammer. This deck actually starts to make a bit more sense because you're going to be using the Magnifistorm monsters that are a part of the Tri-type being utilized as more as fodder so that you can continuously get more monsters in rotation so that you're able to use Tri-Brigade Hammer and the new cards a little bit more efficiently. So using something like running maybe a Sight Trance, like 1 Sight Trance at most, to trigger the ability to just get rid of the hammer from your hand, but also drawing 2 is actually pretty solid and allows the deck to kind of compensate for the lack of Tri-Brigade actually having +1 draws because they don't have that. And I like the fact that having extra Beast Warrior and Wing Beast in the deck means that the engine actually doesn't weaken itself. It actually makes itself a bit more useful in that regard. So I think the Tri-type also beneficially using things like Fualos is actually pretty cool because, like I said, this is a Wing Beast, so this deck actually does have the ability to do hand traps as well, and it keeps it from actually not being able to run the massive amount of hand traps that you would imagine, because this engine actually can be very minuscule, so you can still run a good amount of hand traps in the deck and also keep them in theme so the deck can run pretty well. Now, going into another deck that I'm just talking about as experimentals is something like Speedroid. I think this is a deck that definitely could utilize Magnifistorm. I don't think it can use it the best, but that's only because they have this really weird well, not weird, but they have this really slight drawback of having the machines be the main focus. So Wind Machines is kind of there. The reason I bring it up is that the Magnifistorms actually can facilitate a few plays in the deck pretty okay because they are wind monsters and they can help out the Speedroid deck by just simply giving it a little bit more of a push. I mention this because stuff like the pendulums, for instance, and like Machine Marble, one thing I always realize with this archetype is that it has a really weird thing where its pendulum scales exist for the deck, but it's like it can't really clear them. But I thought about it in the good way of like, well, you could actually pop the scale like the Marble Machine with like MST, and then you can actually set another scale of your actual pendulums for the Speedroid archetype in Pendulum Summon, so you could actually set that up. It's not perfect, of course, but, you know, it is just an idea, and I think I could see this working because it does give you a lot of level 3 access with the different Magnifistorm monsters in the main deck, so it is up to them, and there is some quick plays in Speedroid to use with Sight Trance. Now, finally, we'll be going over some tech monsters and explaining how this deck can actually run with it and the engine ability. So one thing that I found amazing is that this deck is filled with the different types and it is a wind attribute. So if you want to run pure Goes and Match, I think it's completely fine. And you could run There Can Be Only One. I think There Can Be Only One and, you know, Goes and set up in this deck is actually hilarious because this deck focuses on basically doing minimal control. So I don't really know what the win condition would be in terms of like OTK the opponent or hoping they scoop, but definitely you could build up and lock them down with these two like continuous traps and just keep it going that way. But additionally, there's some really interesting techs you can run. One I found really interesting is Ghost Fairy. This is I think it's Elphobia. This is a psychic monster. This one is interesting because it allows you to reveal a wind monster in your hand, and then until the end of your opponent's next main phase, they cannot, or monster effects cannot be activated by monsters that have a higher level than that monster you revealed. So the reason this is insane is because when this card is activated, this card effectively floodgates your opponent's main phase 1. Because it says main phase 1 specifically, if you resolve this effect, and it is a psychic, so it can be summoned through emergency teleport, this card really does force your opponent to actually go battle phase, go to main phase 2, and start playing. The reason this is important is that in the Magnifistorm deck, this is enough to hold off the turn, because your opponent would have to normal summon a monster and maybe run this over. If they do that, that's fine. You want them to do that, or you'd use other effects. But the point is, this card is a really interesting floodgate that I don't think anyone can use, really, except this deck. And then, like I said, it's just really like toxic because that card's really strong. And I think it's kind of hilarious that it does what it does by stopping monster effects. The reason that this is a good card in the pure deck, or like the pure version, it is a psychic, so it doesn't really conflict with anything like there can be only one or Gozen match. But more importantly, this is a card that you can run Itelli in the deck with, so you can even run like hand traps like Ghost Ogre, for instance, so that you can fuel your Sight Trance a bit easier because it is a quick play spell. But more importantly, like I said, Ghost Fairy is just insane. Like I said, this card resolves, your opponent's probably going to lose. Like, I mean, I'm not going to say guaranteed, but they're probably going to lose in terms of like they're not going to be able to establish a board they want. And if whatever engine you're running together with the deck is solid enough, this might be enough to just end the game. And then finally, I didn't want to talk about Cherubini here because all the main deck monsters for the most part being level 3s as the basic starting point is extremely good because this does enable a lot of shenanigans in other decks. I did want to mention though, like when I think about the problem with Magnifistorms being that they don't inherently have synergy with every deck, they only have so many synergies. I think it's still important to mention that a lot of level 3 access decks that want to use something like Cherubini definitely can use the Magnifistorm archetype because the monsters are all extenders, which is something I mentioned before, at least in the main deck ones that are level 3s. It does buff the ability for a lot of these level 3 access decks to go into Cherubini, especially at the fact that if you go ahead and special summon out some of the monsters and gain, abilities to search for certain cards, this can help out down the line. So decks like Phantom Knights, for instance, Burning Abyss to maybe some extent, and additionally, like I think it's Goblin Biker to an extent, they all can run some of these cards because the level 3 does have access to Cherubini, and it can get you moving in that direction. But guys, that's what it's going to be today. This has been the Mystical Space Typhoon archetype, and I do hope you guys enjoyed it. I didn't go over it in broad scaling because there isn't too much competitive success from the deck at the moment, but this is a very interesting deck that a lot of people might be sleeping on, so it could be up to you to decide what happens here. But I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, remember to let me know down below in the comments what you think. Tell me what your favorite card that's going to be out of Dooms of Dimension will be, and also to make sure to check out Rumble's early access so that you do not forget that there are videos coming out on Rumble that we won't see until later on, so you get access to it. But I'm getting out of here, guys, and as always, this has been Brad from the Ed Army signing off, and for all of you out there, to sign on.